Andrew Collins had everything: wealth, power, control. Nothing in his life happened without his permission. Until the day his ex showed up unannounced, her eyes filled with fear, and said the words that shattered his world. "Your daughter is in the hospital." He didn't have a daughter. At least, that's what he had always believed. But as the truth unraveled, one thing became terrifyingly clear: he was already 5 years too late. Andrew Collins had spent years building a life where surprises didn't exist. His days were carefully planned, his time meticulously managed, and his focus never wavered from the empire he had created. As the CEO of Collins Enterprises, he had everything a man could want: wealth, power, and absolute control. His world operated like a well-oiled machine, and there was no room for unexpected disruptions. That was why, when he stepped out of his office that evening, he wasn't prepared for what was waiting for him. The moment he saw her, something in his chest tightened. Sophie Reeves stood near the entrance of his building, her dark brown hair slightly tousled by the wind, her arms crossed over her chest. There was something different about her, something in her posture, in the way she was gripping the strap of her bag so tightly, as if she were holding herself together. For a second, Andrew considered walking past her, pretending not to notice. It had been 5 years since they had spoken, 5 years since he had walked away from whatever it was they had shared. It hadn't been love, not in the way she had wanted it to be. At least, that's what he had told himself back then. He sighed, pushing away the irritation creeping into his voice. "Sophie." Her dark eyes flicked up to meet his, and the instant he saw the emotion in them, he knew something was wrong. Sophie was many things, but she wasn't the kind of woman who came running back to the past without a reason. "We need to talk," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was something fragile underneath it, something that sent a strange feeling through him. Andrew checked his watch. He had a dinner meeting in 20 minutes, a deal worth millions on the line. He didn't have time for this. "I'm busy," he said, keeping his tone firm but not unkind. "If this is about the past, Sophie, I don't think there's anything left to." "It's not about us," she interrupted, and for the first time, he noticed the way her hands were trembling. "It's about my daughter." Something in the way she said it made his stomach tighten. He wasn't sure why. "Your daughter," he repeated, his brows drawing together. "I didn't know you had a kid." Sophie swallowed hard, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. It was the first time he had ever seen her look nervous. Sophie had always been confident, sharp-tongued, and unshaken, even in the worst of situations. But now, she looked as if she was barely holding herself together. "She's 5, Sophie said, her voice quieter now. "And she's in the hospital." Andrew felt the first flicker of something uneasy crawl down his spine, but he forced himself to stay composed. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I don't understand what this has to do with me." Sophie inhaled sharply, and when she looked at him again, he saw it, the hesitation, the fear, the moment she decided to say the words that would change everything. "She's your daughter, Andrew." The world seemed to tilt for a moment. The sounds of the city faded, the movement of people walking past became a blur. His mind refused to process what she had just said. He stared at her, searching her face for any sign that this was some kind of cruel joke. But there was nothing. Only truth. His throat felt dry. "That's not possible." Sophie's eyes flashed with something sharp. "It is. And I wouldn't be here if I had any other choice." Andrew took a step back, shaking his head. His entire life had been built on certainty, on logic, on knowing exactly what was coming next. This was impossible. "You should have told me," he said, his voice colder than he intended. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "And what would you have done, Andrew? 5 years ago, you told me there was no room in your life for a family. You made your choice. And I made mine." He didn't have an answer to that. Because she wasn't wrong. But none of that mattered anymore. Because somewhere in a hospital room, there was a little girl. His daughter. And for the first time in his life, Andrew Collins didn't know what to do next. Andrew Collins had always been a man who thrived on control. Every decision he made, every risk he took, was calculated down to the finest detail. He never walked into a negotiation unprepared. He never allowed emotion to cloud his judgment. But standing in front of Sophie Reeves, hearing her say the words that had just shattered the foundation of his carefully built life, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: uncertainty. His daughter. The words echoed in his mind, but they still didn't feel real. He searched Sophie's face for any sign of deception, any indication that this was some kind of cruel manipulation, but there was nothing but truth in her dark eyes. Truth and something else. Something desperate. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to focus. If this is true, why are you telling me now? Why after 5 years? Sophie's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. Because I don't have a choice anymore. Andrew's jaw clenched. He didn't like the sound of that. What do you mean? She hesitated for half a second, but that was all it took for him to see it, the fear she was trying to keep buried. Sophie wasn't the kind of woman who scared easily. When they had been together, she had always been strong, independent, unwilling to show weakness. But right now, she looked like she was barely holding herself together. She inhaled sharply. Lily's sick, Andrew. It's her heart. His stomach twisted at the name. Lily. His daughter. He ran a hand over his face, trying to ground himself. How bad is it? Sophie swallowed, and in that moment, he knew. It was worse than he wanted to believe. She needs surgery, she said finally. A serious one. The doctors say she has a good chance, but there are risks. And she's scared. She keeps asking for her dad. Andrew's chest tightened. He had spent years avoiding attachments, keeping his life streamlined, focused, free of distractions. He had convinced himself that relationships, real relationships, weren't worth the complications. But none of that mattered now. Why didn't you tell me before? His voice was quieter now, the edge of anger dulled by something heavier. Sophie let out a soft, bitter laugh. And what would you have done, Andrew? 5 years ago, you were obsessed with your company, with your next big deal. You told me you didn't believe in love, that family wasn't part of your plan. Do you really think you would have dropped everything for a child you didn't even want? Andrew didn't have an answer. Because the truth was, she was probably right. But that didn't change the fact that he should have known. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. I want to see her. Sophie's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Are you sure? The question hit him harder than he expected. Was he sure? No. Nothing about this was certain. Nothing about this fit into the structured world he had built for himself. But he knew one thing for sure. He had already missed 5 years of his daughter's life. He wasn't going to miss another second. I'm sure, he said. Take me to her. Sophie studied him for a long moment, as if searching for any sign that he would back out. Then she nodded. Okay. Andrew exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had faced the toughest businessmen in the world, negotiated deals worth billions, stood in front of rooms full of people expecting him to be the smartest man there. But as he followed Sophie out of the building, stepping into the unknown, he realized something terrifying. For the first time in his life, he had no idea what came next. The drive to the hospital was quiet, filled with a tension that neither Andrew nor Sophie attempted to break. The city lights blurred past the windows, but Andrew barely noticed them. His mind was too consumed by what was ahead of him. He had walked into countless high-stakes meetings, stood before some of the most powerful men in the world, and never once had he felt the kind of uncertainty pressing down on him now. Sophie sat beside him, staring straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap. Every so often, he saw her fingers twitch, as if she wanted to say something but thought better of it. He didn't push. He wasn't sure he wanted to hear anything else until he saw the truth with his own eyes. When they pulled into the hospital parking lot, Sophie finally turned to him. Her expression was guarded, but beneath it, he could see exhaustion. "She doesn't know you're coming," she said. Andrew nodded, unbuckling his seatbelt. "How much does she know about me?" Sophie hesitated. "I told her about you in the way a child would understand. She knows your name. She knows that you weren't around but that it wasn't because you didn't care. I never wanted her to think she wasn't wanted." Her words stung more than he expected. He wasn't sure if it was because she had tried to protect him in his absence or because he knew deep down that his absence was the result of his own choices, even if he hadn't been aware of them. Sophie got out of the car, and he followed, his steps slower than usual. He wasn't sure why his body felt heavier with every step he took toward the hospital doors. Inside, the hallways were sterile and quiet, filled with the faint sounds of beeping monitors and distant murmurs of nurses and doctors moving between rooms. The smell of antiseptic and something faintly metallic filled the air. Andrew had always hated hospitals. They had a way of making even the most powerful men feel small. Sophie led him down the hall, stopping in front of a door with a small nameplate that simply read Lily Reeves. Andrew's throat tightened at the sight of it. Sophie turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Are you ready?" No. He wasn't. But he nodded anyway. She pushed open the door, stepping inside first, and he followed, his heart pounding harder than it ever had in his life. The room was small, softly lit, with a single hospital bed in the center. And in that bed, curled up beneath a pale blue blanket, was a little girl. Andrew's breath caught in his throat. She was so small. Her dark brown hair was slightly messy, curling at the ends, and her face was pale against the stark whiteness of the pillow. She looked fragile, like she could disappear if he blinked. But it wasn't just her size or the machines around her that made his chest tighten. It was her eyes. The moment they fluttered open, sleepy and hazy from rest, they locked onto him. Bright, crystal blue. His blue. The same shade he saw in the mirror every morning. His legs felt rooted to the floor, his pulse hammering in his ears. Lily blinked at him, then turned her gaze to Sophie, her small voice soft but curious. "Mommy, who's that?" Sophie glanced at Andrew, giving him the space to answer. He forced himself to take a step closer, his voice quieter than it had ever been. "Hi, Lily." He swallowed hard. "I'm your dad." For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Lily's little brows furrowed, as if she were processing the words. Then, to his absolute shock, a tiny smile appeared on her lips. "You're real." Andrew let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I'm real." Lily looked up at Sophie as if confirming it for herself. Sophie nodded gently, her expression unreadable. Lily turned back to Andrew, studying him for a long moment. "You look like me." A strange mix of emotions swelled in his chest, threatening to crush him. He had spent his whole life building a legacy, a reputation, an empire. But nothing had ever struck him as deeply as those 4 simple words. He took another step forward, hesitating before reaching for her tiny hand resting on the blanket. His fingers barely brushed against hers, but the moment their skin touched, something inside him shifted. "I guess I do," he murmured. Lily yawned, her eyes already growing heavy again. But before she drifted off, she gave his fingers a tiny squeeze. "You stayed," she mumbled sleepily. Andrew swallowed hard. "I did." As her breathing evened out, he stayed there, holding her hand, watching her sleep. And for the first time in his life, nothing else in the world mattered. Andrew sat beside Lily's bed for what felt like hours, unable to take his eyes off her. Every slow rise and fall of her small chest made something inside him tighten. She looked peaceful in sleep, but the reality of where they were, the machines around her, and the quiet hum of the hospital reminded him that this wasn't just a normal father-daughter introduction. This was a hospital room. His daughter was sick. And he hadn't even known she existed. Sophie sat across from him, her arms crossed over her chest, watching him carefully. He could feel her gaze on him, assessing, waiting. She had every right to be wary. He hadn't earned his place here. He hadn't earned anything when it came to Lily. After a long silence, Sophie spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "You don't have to stay." Andrew looked up sharply. "I'm not leaving." Sophie sighed, rubbing her temple. "I'm not saying you have to walk away forever. I just know this is a lot to process. And I don't expect you to suddenly." "I'm not leaving," he repeated, his tone firmer this time. Something flickered in her expression, something she quickly hid. "Okay." Andrew turned back to Lily, watching as she stirred slightly in her sleep. His mind was racing with too many thoughts, too many questions. He didn't even know where to begin. Finally, he forced himself to ask the one question he dreaded most. "How bad is it?" Sophie's posture stiffened. "The doctors say she has a congenital heart condition. It's been manageable until now, but her condition has worsened. She needs surgery. Soon." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His daughter needed surgery, and he hadn't even known she existed until today. He had missed so much. He had missed everything. He clenched his jaw, trying to steady himself. "Is she in pain?" Sophie hesitated before shaking her head. "Not all the time. Some days are worse than others. She gets tired easily. Her heart has to work harder than it should." Andrew swallowed hard, gripping the armrest of the chair beside the bed. "And the surgery? What are the risks?" Sophie's face paled slightly, and for the first time, he saw something in her that unnerved him. Fear. "There are always risks. But the doctors say she has a good chance. If we do this soon, she has a future." The word hit him in a way he wasn't expecting. Future. A future he hadn't even known existed until today. A future that depended on something he had no control over. Andrew had spent his entire life in control. He didn't know how to handle this feeling of complete helplessness. Sophie shifted in her chair, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her jeans. "The surgery is expensive." Andrew snapped his gaze to her. "Money isn't an issue." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I'm not asking you for money, Andrew." He narrowed his eyes. "Then why did you come to me now?" Sophie let out a slow breath, and when she looked at him, her dark eyes held something raw, something he wasn't prepared for. "Because she asked for you." Andrew felt something inside him crack. "She didn't even know me." "She knew of you," Sophie corrected. "I told her stories, little things. I never wanted her to feel like she was missing something. But when she got sick, when she got scared, she wanted to meet you." Andrew couldn't breathe for a moment. His daughter had wanted him. She had asked for him. And he hadn't even known. He looked back at Lily, at the tiny fingers curled around the edge of her blanket. He could still feel the warmth of her small hand from earlier, the way she had squeezed his fingers before drifting off to sleep. He had spent years telling himself that family wasn't in his plans. That love, relationships, children, none of it fit into the life he had built. But now, staring at the little girl who shared his eyes, the little girl who had been fighting a battle he hadn't even known about, he realized how wrong he had been. He had already missed 5 years. He wouldn't miss another second. He turned back to Sophie, his voice steady, his decision made. "Tell me everything I need to know. I'm not going anywhere." Andrew had always been a man of action. When faced with a problem, he found a solution. When obstacles appeared, he removed them. His world was built on control, logic, and decisive action. But nothing about this situation was in his control. Nothing about this moment allowed for a clean, strategic solution. For the first time in his life, he was completely powerless. He sat beside Lily's bed, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest as she slept. The machines monitoring her heartbeat beeped softly in the background, a constant reminder that time was not on their side. He had spent his entire life chasing numbers, profit margins, and power, but none of it mattered in this room. Here, the only thing that mattered was her. Sophie sat across from him, arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if trying to shield herself from the weight of the conversation they were about to have. He had told her to tell him everything. Now that she was ready to, he wasn't sure he wanted to hear it. She exhaled slowly, running a hand through her dark brown hair. The condition she has is called congenital heart disease. She was diagnosed when she was a baby. At first, it was mild. Something the doctors monitored but didn't think would become life-threatening. But over the past year, things changed. She started getting tired more easily. She would get dizzy, sometimes even collapse. I knew something was wrong, but I kept hoping the doctors would tell me it was just temporary. Andrew's jaw tightened as she spoke. He hated that she had gone through this alone. He hated that Lily had been fighting this battle without him even knowing she existed. Sophie continued, her voice quieter now. They told me a few months ago that she would need surgery. At first, I thought I could handle everything myself. I started working extra hours, saving everything I could, applying for financial assistance. But even with all that, it wasn't enough. And then, last week, Lily asked me something that changed everything. She hesitated, looking down at her hands as if the memory was too much. When she finally spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. She asked me if her daddy would come see her before she went to sleep forever. Andrew felt like the air had been ripped from his lungs. Sophie looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with something raw. That's when I knew I had to find you. Andrew clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as a wave of emotions crashed over him. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to tell Sophie that she had no right to keep this from him, that he should have been there from the beginning. But none of that would change the past. None of it would fix what had already been done. Instead, he forced himself to focus on the present. What's the next step? Sophie blinked at him, as if she hadn't expected him to ask that question. The surgery is scheduled for next week. The doctors are optimistic, but there are risks. She'll need time to recover, and she'll have to be monitored closely for a while after. Andrew nodded, absorbing the information. I'll cover everything. Sophie's lips pressed into a thin line. I told you, I didn't come here for your money. He met her gaze evenly. And I told you, I'm not leaving. I don't care what you think this is about. She's my daughter, Sophie. I will do whatever it takes to make sure she gets the best care possible. She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether or not she believed him. Finally, she sighed, nodding slightly. Okay. Silence settled between them, heavy but no longer hostile. For the first time since she had shown up at his office, they weren't fighting. They were just two parents trying to figure out how to help their child. Andrew leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze locked on Lily's sleeping face. Does she know? Sophie tilted her head slightly. Know what? He swallowed hard. That I wasn't there because I didn't know. That it wasn't my choice. Sophie hesitated. I never told her you left because I didn't want her to feel unwanted. I told her that sometimes daddies have to be far away, but that doesn't mean they don't care. She never hated you for not being here. She just wondered when you'd come. Andrew closed his eyes for a moment, trying to push past the guilt clawing at his chest. He had spent his whole life avoiding attachments, convincing himself that love and family were complications he didn't need. But sitting here now, he realized how wrong he had been. He opened his eyes, looking at Sophie. "I want her to know I'm staying." Sophie nodded. "Then prove it." Andrew didn't respond right away. He just reached for Lily's tiny hand, gently wrapping his fingers around hers. He had made billion-dollar deals, built an empire from nothing, and held power over thousands of people. But in this moment, sitting in a hospital room with a little girl who had no idea how much she had already changed his life, he realized that this was the most important thing he had ever done. He wasn't going anywhere. Andrew spent the next few days at the hospital, barely leaving Lily's side. He had cancelled every meeting, pushed aside every business obligation, and told his assistant to clear his schedule indefinitely. Nothing else mattered. The empire he had built, the wealth he had accumulated, the power he had spent years securing, it all felt meaningless compared to the tiny girl in the hospital bed, holding on to life with quiet strength he didn't know a child could have. Lily had woken up a few times, each moment pulling him deeper into something he wasn't prepared for. She would blink up at him with those same blue eyes he saw in the mirror every morning, offering him small, sleepy smiles as if he had always been there. She didn't look at him with anger or confusion. She wasn't scared of him. She accepted him without hesitation, as if she had been waiting for him all along. One afternoon, as he sat beside her bed, flipping through a children's book he had picked up from the hospital gift shop, she stirred and turned her head toward him. Her voice was small and tired but filled with curiosity. "Daddy, how come you didn't come sooner?" The question knocked the breath out of him. He looked at Sophie, who was sitting in the corner of the room, but she didn't interfere. This was his moment. He had to find the right words, even if he wasn't sure there were any that could make up for what had been lost. He set the book down, leaning forward slightly. "I didn't know about you, Lily." His voice was softer than it had ever been. "If I had, I would have been here." She seemed to think about that for a moment. Then she reached out, her small fingers brushing against his hand. "But you're here now." Andrew swallowed hard, his throat tight. He turned his palm up and let her tiny fingers curl into his. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm here now." She smiled, as if that was all she needed. Sophie let out a quiet breath from across the room, and for the first time in days, she didn't look like she was bracing for a fight. Later that evening, after Lily had fallen asleep again, Andrew stepped out into the hallway. He ran a hand through his hair, taking a slow, steadying breath. He hadn't allowed himself to fully process everything yet. Every moment since Sophie had appeared in his office had been a whirlwind, pushing him forward before he could make sense of the weight of it all. Sophie joined him outside the room, crossing her arms over her chest. "She really likes you," she said quietly. Andrew let out a small, humorless chuckle. "That makes one of us." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "You don't like yourself?" He looked away, jaw tightening. "I don't like that I missed 5 years of her life. I don't like that she was here, getting sicker, while I was out there thinking I had everything I needed. I don't like that I was so blind." Sophie sighed, rubbing her temple. "Andrew," she hesitated. "You can't change the past." He turned to face her, his blue eyes sharp. "But you could have." Her expression hardened. "And what would you have done if I had told you back then? You weren't exactly the family type." He opened his mouth, ready to argue, but the words didn't come. She was right. If she had told him back then, would he have been ready? Would he have walked away? He hated the thought, but he didn't know the answer. Sophie softened slightly, her voice losing its edge. "I didn't tell you to hurt you. I told you now because she asked for you. Because I saw the way she looked at me, hoping I would say yes when she asked if you'd ever come." Andrew closed his eyes for a brief second, letting that sink in. He had never been needed before. People respected him, feared him, depended on him in business, but no one had ever needed him like this. He turned back to Sophie, his voice steady. "I'm not leaving her." Sophie studied him for a long moment before nodding. Good. They stood in silence for a while, the weight of everything heavy between them. Andrew had walked into this hospital as a man who had thought he had control over his life. Now, he understood that control had always been an illusion. For the first time in years, he wasn't chasing power, success, or money. He was standing still, holding on to something far more important. And he wasn't letting go. The night before Lily's surgery was the longest of Andrew's life. He had faced high-stakes negotiations, billion-dollar deals, and ruthless competitors, but nothing had ever made him feel as helpless as watching his daughter sleep, knowing that in just a few hours, she would be on an operating table, fighting for her life. He sat in the chair beside her bed, his fingers lightly wrapped around her small hand. The monitors beeped in a steady rhythm, a sound that had become both comforting and terrifying over the past few days. Sophie sat on the other side of the bed, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were trying to hold herself together. They had barely spoken in the last hour. Words felt useless. There was nothing left to say that could ease the weight pressing down on both of them. At one point, Lily stirred, her eyelids fluttering open as she let out a soft, sleepy sigh. Her blue eyes found his in the dim light of the room, and she gave him a small, drowsy smile. "Daddy, you're still here." His throat tightened, but he forced himself to smile. "Of course, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere." She let out a tiny yawn and blinked up at him. "Are you scared?" Andrew wasn't sure how to answer that. He had spent his whole life pretending fear didn't exist. Fear was weakness. Fear was something he crushed before it had a chance to take hold. But right now, looking at his daughter, fear was the only thing he could feel. He squeezed her hand gently. "I just want you to be okay." Lily studied him for a moment, then whispered, "I will be." The certainty in her voice made something deep inside him ache. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't doubting anything. She believed she would be fine, and she believed that he would be here when she woke up. He had never been someone's source of comfort before. He had never been someone's safe place. But Lily had already decided that he was. She gave his hand a small squeeze. "Can you tell me a story?" Andrew glanced at Sophie, who met his gaze with tired eyes. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. This was his moment. He turned back to Lily, clearing his throat slightly. "Okay. Let's see." He had never been good at telling stories, but he forced himself to think. Once upon a time, there was a very strong little girl. She was braver than knights and smarter than wizards. And one day, she had to go on a very important adventure. Lily's eyelids were already growing heavy again, but she was listening. What kind of adventure? Andrew brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. A journey to make her heart even stronger. She had lots of people who loved her, and they would all be waiting for her when she got back. Lily smiled sleepily. "Like you?" His chest ached, and he nodded. "Yeah, baby girl. Like me." She exhaled softly, her grip on his hand loosening as she drifted back into sleep. Andrew didn't move. He stayed exactly where he was, watching her, memorizing every little breath, every small twitch of her fingers. He couldn't stop thinking about how much he had already missed. Her first words. Her first steps. The way she had probably looked up at Sophie 1,000 times over the years and asked when she would get to meet her dad. Sophie shifted slightly in her chair, letting out a quiet sigh. "You should try to rest." Andrew shook his head. "I can't." She didn't argue. She understood. They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of everything they had been through hanging between them. Finally, Sophie spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "She really believes in you." Andrew swallowed hard. "I don't want to let her down." Sophie looked at him, something unreadable in her expression. "Then don't." Andrew held his daughter's hand a little tighter. He had spent his whole life chasing things that never really mattered. But right here, in this quiet hospital room, with his daughter curled up beside him and Sophie sitting across from him, he finally understood what did matter. And he wasn't going to lose it. The morning of the surgery arrived too quickly. The hours had passed in a blur, and before Andrew was ready, the nurses were coming in, preparing Lily to be taken to the operating room. He had spent the night sitting in the chair beside her bed, holding her hand even while she slept, afraid to let go. Sophie had dozed off in the corner of the room for a few hours, but the second the door opened that morning, she was wide awake, standing at Lily's side. Lily, still groggy from sleep, rubbed her eyes and looked up at them with a small, sleepy smile. "Is it time?" Andrew forced himself to smile back, even though every part of him wanted to say no. "Yeah, sweetheart. It's time." She reached for his hand, and he took it, wrapping his fingers gently around hers. "Will you be here when I wake up?" His throat felt tight, but he nodded. "I'll be right here." Sophie leaned down, brushing Lily's hair back. "So will I, baby." Lily yawned and gave them both a drowsy smile. "Okay." A few minutes later, the nurses arrived with the stretcher. Andrew stepped back, feeling his chest tighten as they gently lifted Lily and placed her onto it. Her tiny frame looked even smaller surrounded by all the medical equipment. He hated this. He hated that he couldn't do anything. He had spent his entire life fixing problems, but this was something he couldn't fix. As they wheeled her toward the door, Lily turned her head and looked back at them. "Love you, Mommy. Love you, Daddy." Andrew had never heard those words before. Not from her. They hit him like a tidal wave, crashing over him with a force he hadn't been prepared for. He felt his control slipping, but he didn't care. He leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I love you too, baby girl." Sophie sniffled and kissed her hand. "We love you so much." Lily gave them one last sleepy smile before the nurses wheeled her out of the room. The second she was gone, Andrew felt the weight of the moment slam into him. The walls of control he had spent years building cracked under the pressure, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt completely, utterly powerless. Sophie stood beside him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, staring at the door as if willing Lily to come right back. Andrew didn't think. He just reached out and took her hand, gripping it tightly. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers curled around his, holding on just as desperately as he was. Hours passed in agonizing silence. Andrew couldn't sit still. He paced the waiting room, unable to focus on anything except the endless ticking of the clock. Sophie sat in one of the chairs, her knee bouncing anxiously. Neither of them spoke much. There was nothing to say. The only thing that mattered was what was happening on the other side of those doors. Every time a doctor or nurse walked past, Andrew's heart clenched, fearing the worst. He had spent his entire life thinking he was untouchable, that nothing could shake him. But this had shaken him to his core. He had never been so afraid. After what felt like a lifetime, a doctor finally approached. Sophie stood immediately, and Andrew was right beside her, his hands clenched into fists. The doctor smiled reassuringly. "The surgery was a success. Lily is stable and recovering well." Andrew let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Sophie's shoulders sagged in relief, and she covered her face with her hands for a moment before whispering, "Thank God." The doctor continued, "She'll be in recovery for a little while, but you can see her soon." Andrew barely heard the rest. All that mattered was that Lily was okay. When they were finally allowed into her room, Andrew felt his chest tighten again at the sight of her. She looked so small, so fragile, hooked up to machines, but she was breathing steadily. Her skin had more color than before, and her tiny hands rested on the blanket, peaceful in sleep. He sat down beside her, brushing his fingers lightly over her hand. Sophie sat on the other side of the bed, watching Lily with tired but relieved eyes. After a while, Lily's eyelashes fluttered, and her blue eyes slowly opened. She blinked up at them, then gave a small, sleepy smile. "Told you I'd be okay." Andrew let out a choked laugh, feeling something inside him break apart and put itself back together at the same time. He squeezed her hand gently. "Yeah, baby. You did." Lily yawned and looked up at him, her voice soft. "Can we go home soon?" Andrew felt something shift inside him at that word. Home, he had spent years thinking home was just a place, a luxury penthouse, a space filled with expensive furniture and nothing else. But sitting here, with his daughter looking up at him, waiting for an answer, he realized home wasn't a place at all. It was this. It was her. It was Sophie. It was something he had spent his whole life running from, only to realize it was all he had ever needed. He nodded, his voice steady. "Yeah, sweetheart. Soon." Sophie reached across the bed, resting a hand over Lily's. "We're going home together." Lily smiled, satisfied with that answer, and slowly drifted back to sleep. Andrew leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The fear that had gripped him for days was still there, but it no longer controlled him. The past was behind them. The future was uncertain. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. This story is about redemption, the weight of lost time, and the power of second chances. Andrew Collins begins as a man who believes he has everything: wealth, control, and a carefully structured life. But when he learns that he has a daughter he never knew existed, everything shifts. He's forced to confront the fact that success means nothing if he has no one to share it with. What makes this journey so powerful is not just Andrew's transformation but also Sophie's struggle to trust him. She had every reason to believe he wouldn't stay, that he was still the man who once chose ambition over love. But through his actions, not just words, he proves that he's ready to be a father. Lily is the heart of the story, the innocent thread that ties them together. She doesn't hold on to the past the way adults do. She doesn't see Andrew as the man who wasn't there, she sees him as the father who is there now. And sometimes, love is that simple. The ending is satisfying because it doesn't rely on grand gestures or perfect resolutions. It's not about Andrew fixing everything overnight. It's about him choosing to stay, choosing to be a father, and proving through every small moment that he's not going anywhere. It's a reminder that while we can't rewrite the past, we can still show up for the future. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything. The courtroom fell into a tense silence. All eyes turned to a little girl with vitiligo standing in the center. She raised her head and unexpectedly said, "I want to eat." These simple words shocked everyone, including the stern judge. What made the girl say this? And most importantly, what happened next? What do you think happened in the end? Share your guesses in the comments. Subscribe to the channel and like the video so you don't miss the next part. The courtroom was a place of order, designed to intimidate and command respect. Tall, arched windows let in narrow streams of light, casting sharp shadows across the polished wooden benches and the imposing bench where the judge sat. The room smelled faintly of varnish and tension, a mixture of authority and suppressed emotions. At the center of the room stood a little girl, no older than 10. Her small frame seemed even smaller under the weight of the dozens of gazes fixed on her. Her skin, marked by patches of vitiligo, created a striking contrast that only drew more attention. Her dress was too large for her slight figure, its edges frayed and faded, a silent testament to the life she had lived before stepping into this cold, formal space. The judge, a man with a stern face and eyes that seemed to pierce through any pretense, sat high above the rest, his gavel resting ominously on the bench. He adjusted his glasses, glancing briefly at the girl before turning his attention back to the thick case files in front of him. On one side of the courtroom sat the attorneys, their sharp suits and briefcases symbolizing power and preparation. They whispered among themselves, occasionally casting quick glances at the girl, their expressions ranging from boredom to disdain. The audience benches were packed with onlookers, some curious, others judgmental. Whispers rippled through the room, faint murmurs of gossip and speculation. "Who is she?" one voice muttered. Another, "Nobody looking for attention," another replied with a sneer. The girl shifted uncomfortably, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her wide eyes scanned the room, filled with fear and determination. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, at least, not this kind of attention. Outside this courtroom, people avoided her gaze, whispered behind her back, or outright mocked her for her unusual skin. Here, though, every set of eyes bore down on her, as though waiting for her to crumble. At the back of the courtroom, a group of young men laughed quietly, their mocking expressions adding another layer of humiliation. A bailiff shot them a warning glance, but the damage was already done. The little girl took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling as she tried to summon courage. The judge cleared his throat, and the whispers died down instantly. "This court is now in session," he announced, his voice echoing through the room like a thunderclap. All eyes remained on the girl as the proceedings began. The storm of emotions, prejudice, judgment, curiosity, hovered over the room, ready to erupt at any moment. She stood there, small yet unyielding, at the center of it all, unaware that her next words would send shockwaves through this austere hall and far beyond. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation as the judge adjusted his glasses and scanned the room. The attorneys whispered in low voices, flipping through their notes, preparing for the routine formalities that would unfold. The audience sat in hushed silence, their gazes darting between the stern-faced judge and the small girl standing in the center of it all. The girl shifted her weight nervously, her feet barely touching the edges of the oversized shoes she wore. Her hands trembled slightly, clutching the hem of her frayed dress. Her skin, a canvas of contrasting tones due to vitiligo, made her presence all the more striking. But it wasn't her appearance that would leave the room frozen, it was her words. She raised her head, her wide eyes locking briefly with the judge's cold stare. Then, with a voice that trembled but carried an undeniable clarity, she spoke. "I want to eat." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Her words, simple yet startling, hung in the air like an uninvited guest. The judge blinked, his pen pausing mid-motion over his notes. One of the attorneys dropped a pen, the clatter breaking the silence. "What did she just say?" a woman in the audience whispered, leaning toward her neighbor. "I want to eat," the girl repeated, her voice louder this time. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. A burst of laughter erupted from the back of the room, crude and mocking. A group of young men exchanged amused glances, their snickering echoing off the walls. "She thinks this is a cafeteria," one of them sneered, loud enough for others to hear. The judge's gavel struck the bench sharply. "Order! This is a courtroom, not a circus," he barked, but even his command couldn't entirely silence the murmurs that rippled through the room. On the opposing side, a lawyer scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Is this some sort of stunt?" he muttered under his breath, his voice dripping with disdain. The girl's lawyer leaned toward her, his face pale with a mix of concern and confusion. "What are you doing?" he whispered urgently. "This isn't the time." But the girl didn't respond to him. She stood still, her gaze unwavering as she looked directly at the judge. The fear in her eyes had faded, replaced by something quieter but far more powerful, determination. The judge stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he seemed to falter, as if unsure how to respond. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice measured and stern. "You understand the seriousness of these proceedings, don't you?" he asked, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Yes," the girl replied, her voice steady. "But I haven't eaten in 2 days." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, the audience exchanging shocked glances. The laughter died instantly, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Even the mocking young men in the back grew quiet, their smirks fading as the weight of her words sank in. The judge sat back in his chair, his brow furrowing. For the first time, the courtroom's cold formality seemed to waver. The little girl's words had pierced through the layers of prejudice and bureaucracy, leaving everyone grappling with an uncomfortable truth. Her statement was not a demand. It was not a plea for pity. It was a raw, unvarnished reality, one that forced every person in that room to confront their own humanity, or lack thereof. As the murmurs faded, the girl stood her ground, her small frame dwarfed by the grandeur of the courtroom. And yet, in that moment, she was the most powerful presence in the room. Before the sterile walls of the courtroom, the girl's life had unfolded in the shadows of hardship. Born into poverty, she grew up in a crumbling tenement on the outskirts of the city, where the walls were thin, and the floors were colder than the air outside. Her mother worked long hours as a cleaner, and her father had disappeared before her first birthday, leaving them to scrape by on meager earnings. But it wasn't just poverty that set her apart. By the time she was 5, white patches began appearing on her dark skin. At first, her mother thought it was a rash, but as the spots spread, it became clear, it was vitiligo. The condition transformed her appearance, making her a target for ridicule in a community already struggling with its own prejudices. At school, the other children didn't see her as just a classmate. They saw her as different, and that difference became her curse. "Patchy girl," they'd jeer, their voices cutting through the air like knives. "Is it contagious? Don't touch her." She learned quickly to walk with her head down, to make herself invisible. But no amount of shrinking into herself could protect her from the taunts, the whispers, or the cruel pranks. Even adults weren't kind. Teachers avoided looking her in the eye, neighbors muttered under their breath, and strangers on the bus moved seats as if her skin was a threat. The rare times her mother managed to take her shopping for clothes, shopkeepers would hover, their disapproving gazes making it clear they weren't welcome. One incident burned in her memory like a scar. At 8 years old, she had gone to the corner store to buy bread with a few crumpled bills. The cashier refused to take the money, staring at her hands with disgust. "I'm not touching that," the man had said, pushing the bills back toward her. "Get out of my store." She had walked home crying, clutching the same crumpled money, feeling as though the world had no place for her. The court case was the result of one final act of cruelty, an eviction notice. The landlord, a man with no patience for troublemakers, as he called her family, had decided he didn't want them in his building anymore. He claimed unpaid rent, despite her mother paying on time for years. When her mother had tried to reason with him, he simply sneered. "Find another place," he had said. "People like you don't belong here anyway." The notice arrived a week later. Her mother, too proud to ask for help and too exhausted to fight, had started packing. But the girl couldn't let it go. She had seen too much injustice to stay silent this time. She convinced her mother to go to court, to stand up against the landlord's lies. And so, she found herself in the courtroom, the center of attention for reasons she wished didn't exist. She wasn't just fighting for a roof over her head. She was fighting against a lifetime of being seen as less than human. Standing in the courtroom, she remembered every moment that had led her here. Every insult, every rejection, every tear her mother had shed in the darkness of their small apartment. The weight of it all bore down on her, but it didn't crush her. It made her stronger. As she looked around the room, she realized this wasn't just about her family. It was about everyone who had ever been pushed aside, ignored, or silenced. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, her voice could make a difference. The judge sat high above the courtroom, his wooden bench towering over everyone else in the room like a throne of judgment. His dark robe was pristine, his powdered wig, though outdated, immaculate, and his glasses perched on the edge of his nose reflected the harsh light of the courtroom. Every inch of him exuded authority and control, his very presence demanding silence and respect. Judge Harris was known throughout the district for his unyielding demeanor. His rulings were as sharp as his words, leaving little room for compassion or nuance. To him, the law was black and white, and so were his opinions of the people who came before him. When his gaze fell upon the little girl standing in the center of the room, his expression hardened. He leaned forward slightly, the weight of his disapproval palpable. To him, she was an annoyance, a distraction from the real cases that deserved his attention. "Miss," he said, his voice cold and clipped. "Do you understand where you are and the seriousness of these proceedings?" The girl nodded, her small frame trembling slightly. But her quiet acknowledgement seemed to irritate him further. "This is not a playground," he continued, his tone growing harsher. "And certainly not a place for theatrics." His words hung in the air, drawing murmurs from the audience. Some whispered in agreement, others exchanged uncomfortable glances. The girl looked down at her feet, her hands twisting the frayed edges of her dress. But she didn't speak. Judge Harris tapped his gavel lightly on the bench, more a warning than a command. "If you have something of value to say, say it. Otherwise, I suggest we proceed with matters of actual importance." The girl raised her head slowly, her wide eyes meeting his cold stare. I just wanted to say." "Speak clearly," he interrupted, his voice cutting through her timid words like a blade. "We don't have all day." The tension in the room thickened. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and even the attorneys exchanged uncertain glances. The judge's impatience was clear, and it set a tone of hostility that made the already oppressive atmosphere even heavier. To Judge Harris, this girl's presence wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a challenge to the order he prided himself on maintaining. Her simple request had disrupted the carefully orchestrated seriousness of his courtroom, and he wasn't about to let her defiance go unchecked. "This is not the time for irrelevant pleas," he snapped, his gavel striking the bench with a sharp crack. "If you cannot contribute meaningfully to these proceedings, you may sit down and remain silent." But the girl didn't move. Her hands trembled, but she stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her to break under the weight of his authority. To Judge Harris, she was just another nuisance, a poor child trying to manipulate the system, using her tears and condition to elicit pity. He had seen it before, or so he thought. He didn't see the courage it took for her to stand there. He didn't hear the desperation in her voice. To him, she was already guilty of wasting his time, and he was determined to remind her of her place. But what Judge Harris couldn't see, what his cold prejudice blinded him to, was that the girl wasn't here to beg. She wasn't here to disrupt. She was here to fight. And no amount of stern words or judicial authority could silence the truth she carried. As the courtroom watched the silent standoff between the towering judge and the trembling girl, it became clear that this moment was more than just another case. It was a clash of worlds, a battle between unyielding prejudice and quiet resilience. The judge's gavel had barely struck the bench before the whispers started. They rippled through the courtroom like a slow, insidious wave, growing louder with each passing second. Eyes darted toward the girl in the center of the room, some filled with curiosity, others with disdain. The corners of mouths curled into smirks, and muffled laughter began to escape from the back rows. "She thinks this is a charity, not a courtroom," someone whispered, loud enough for the people nearby to snicker. "She probably just wants attention," another murmured, their words dripping with contempt. The girl stood still, her small frame rigid as the weight of their words bore down on her. Her hands clutched the hem of her tattered dress, fingers trembling, but her face remained calm. She kept her eyes down, fixed on the scuffed floor beneath her worn shoes, as though drawing strength from its solidity. From the back of the room, a young man leaned over to his friend, a mocking grin spreading across his face. "Maybe she thinks she can cry her way out of this. Poor little patchwork girl." Laughter broke out, sharper and louder this time. The sound echoed through the courtroom, bouncing off the cold walls and piercing the oppressive silence. Order! Judge Harris snapped, his gavel striking the bench with a loud crack. His voice cut through the noise, but the atmosphere of ridicule lingered like smoke in the air. The girl's lawyer, a middle-aged man with a kind but weary face, stood abruptly. His chair scraped loudly against the floor, drawing attention to him. He cleared his throat, adjusting his tie as he turned to address the court. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this child has the right to be heard," he began, his voice steady but firm. "Mocking and demeaning her does nothing to serve the interests of justice." A woman in the audience rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath. "Of course he's defending her. Sympathy gets votes." The lawyer ignored the comment, but the set of his jaw tightened. He turned to Judge Harris, his tone growing sharper. "This courtroom should be a place of fairness, not a spectacle." The judge raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "If you have a point, counselor, I suggest you make it quickly," he said coolly. Before the lawyer could respond, another voice from the audience cut through. "What fairness? People like her don't even belong here." The girl flinched at the words but didn't look up. Her lawyer clenched his fists at his sides, visibly restraining himself. "Your Honor, this is unacceptable," he said, his voice rising slightly. "This child deserves respect." "Sit down, counselor," the judge interrupted, his tone final. "Let's not waste any more time on theatrics." The lawyer hesitated, his lips pressed into a thin line. Reluctantly, he sank back into his chair, his shoulders stiff with frustration. He glanced at the girl, his expression softening. "It's going to be okay," he whispered, though even he seemed unsure. The girl didn't respond. She remained silent, her head bowed, her breathing steady despite the humiliation swirling around her. Every fiber of her being wanted to shrink, to disappear from the scornful eyes and hateful words. But she didn't. She stayed rooted to the spot, refusing to let their mockery break her. For every laugh, every insult, she held on to the faint spark of determination within her. She was here for a reason, something bigger than herself, bigger than their judgment. The room eventually quieted, but the hostility lingered. The girl's silence spoke louder than any words could, a quiet defiance that even the judge seemed to notice. And though no one would admit it, her unyielding presence began to shift something in the air. For the first time, some of the whispers turned to uneasy silence, and the laughter faded into murmurs of uncertainty. The girl, small and trembling, stood taller than anyone in the room. Amid the mocking whispers, stifled laughter, and simmering contempt, one figure remained silent. Seated near the back of the courtroom, partially obscured by the shadows cast from the high windows, a man watched the proceedings with an intensity that seemed out of place among the casual disdain of the crowd. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his suit impeccably tailored yet unassuming in its muted tones. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but his eyes told a different story. They followed every movement of the girl at the center of the room, the way her hands gripped the hem of her dress, the slight tremble in her frame, the quiet resolve in her lowered gaze. Unlike the others, he neither whispered nor laughed. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of curiosity and something else, something deeper, almost protective. When the judge's gavel cracked against the bench, silencing the room, the man's gaze briefly flicked toward the stern figure on the podium, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. He leaned forward in his seat, his hands clasped loosely, as if bracing himself for something. Though his presence went unnoticed by most, the girl's lawyer caught his eye for a fleeting moment. There was something about the man that set him apart, an aura of authority, a quiet confidence that demanded attention without a single word. The lawyer hesitated, his frustration momentarily replaced by a flicker of hope. Who was this man? He wasn't a regular attendee, his polished demeanor and piercing gaze suggested he didn't belong among the jeering crowd. Yet he sat there, unmoving, watching everything unfold as though cataloging every word, every gesture. The girl, standing in the center of the courtroom, seemed oblivious to the silent observer. Her focus was on the judge, the weight of the room pressing down on her. But as the man adjusted his position, the faintest creak of his chair reached her ears. For a split second, her eyes darted toward him, meeting his gaze. She froze. His expression didn't soften, but something in his eyes seemed to hold a quiet reassurance, a steady presence that she hadn't felt from anyone else in the room. She quickly looked away, but the moment lingered in her mind, a small ember of courage reignited by the fleeting connection. The man's attention never wavered. When the audience erupted in laughter, his brow furrowed slightly, the faintest sign of disapproval crossing his features. When the judge interrupted the girl's lawyer, his fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair, a silent rhythm of impatience. Whoever he was here for a reason. And though he remained silent, his presence was anything but passive. As the proceedings dragged on, his gaze sharpened, shifting between the judge, the girl, and the audience. He seemed to be piecing something together, as if the courtroom were a puzzle he intended to solve. And while the rest of the room was blinded by prejudice and disdain, he saw something no one else did, the quiet strength of the girl standing alone at the center of it all. This silent observer wasn't just a bystander. He was waiting, watching, preparing. Though no one knew it yet, his role in the courtroom would soon become impossible to ignore. The courtroom was silent again, the tension as thick as the cold air in the room. The girl stood in the center, her small hands clutching the hem of her tattered dress. Her gaze flickered between the judge, her lawyer, and the crowd of hostile faces. Her lips trembled, but she swallowed hard and straightened her back. "You have the floor," Judge Harris said coldly, tapping his gavel lightly on the bench. His tone carried more impatience than encouragement, but the girl didn't flinch. She took a deep breath, her voice shaky but clear. "My name is Nia," she began, her words hanging in the stillness. "I'm here because I've been treated like I don't matter. Like I'm not even human." The murmurs began almost immediately. Someone scoffed from the back of the room, and another person chuckled under their breath. The judge raised a hand for silence, his expression stern, but even he seemed more annoyed than concerned about the girl's words. Nia pressed on, her voice growing stronger. "Since I was little, people look at me like I'm dirty. Like my skin makes me something they don't want to see. They call me names. They laugh at me." She paused, her voice catching. "And they make me feel like I don't belong anywhere." A woman in the audience shook her head, her whisper loud enough to carry. "Oh, poor thing. Playing the victim now." Nia's hands tightened around the fabric of her dress, but she didn't stop. "Last week, the landlord came to our apartment. My mom was sick, and I tried to talk to him. I told him we paid rent every month. I told him my mom just needed more time. He didn't care." Her voice wavered, but her determination didn't falter. "He called us dirty. He said people like us don't deserve to live there. He said we should go back where we came from." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, some in shock, others in derision. Nia's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, his jaw clenched as he tried to gauge the judge's reaction. The judge leaned forward, his expression inscrutable. "Do you have proof of these accusations?" he asked, his tone cutting. Nia met his gaze, her small chin lifted defiantly. "I don't have papers, but I remember every word he said. And I remember the way he looked at me. Like I wasn't even worth talking to." The room erupted into murmurs again, louder this time. "She's just making it up," someone said. "Always playing the race card," another muttered. But not everyone dismissed her words. A man in the middle row leaned forward, his brow furrowed. A woman near the back shifted uncomfortably, her lips pressed into a thin line. Nia continued, her voice breaking slightly as she recounted more moments of cruelty. "At school, the kids would throw things at me. They'd say I was contagious. They'd tell me to cover my skin because it made them sick." She paused, her eyes brimming with tears. "One day, I came home crying. My mom told me to be strong. She said people can be mean when they don't understand. But why do I have to be strong every day? Why do people have to be mean just because I look different? The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence. The laughter and scoffing had died down, replaced by a weight that seemed to press down on everyone present. Even Judge Harris, who had remained stoic throughout, shifted slightly in his seat. Nia's voice softened, but her words carried the force of a storm. I'm not here to make you feel sorry for me. I'm here because what's happening to me, to my mom, to people like us, it's not right. And if I don't say it, who will? Her final words hung in the air, a challenge no one dared to answer. The room, once filled with mockery and disdain, was now silent, the weight of her story sinking into every corner. Nia lowered her gaze, her small shoulders trembling slightly. But in that moment, she had done something few expected. She had forced them to see her, not as an object of ridicule or pity, but as a person. A person with a voice, a story, and a strength that no amount of prejudice could erase. The silence stretched on, and for the first time, the courtroom seemed to belong to her. The silence in the courtroom was deafening, a heavy weight that pressed down on everyone present. Nia's words still lingered in the air, raw and undeniable, carving through the layers of prejudice like a blade. Most people sat in awkward stillness, some glancing at their feet, others avoiding each other's eyes. But then, from the back of the room, a chair scraped against the polished floor, breaking the silence. All heads turned as a man in a sharp gray suit stood up. His presence had been understated until now, just another figure in the crowd. But now, as he stepped forward, his commanding aura seemed to fill the room. It was the silent observer. He cleared his throat, his voice calm but resolute. Your Honor, he began, addressing the judge with a formality that carried an undercurrent of challenge. With all due respect, this child deserves more than silence and mockery. She deserves justice. The judge's cold stare turned to the man, his gavel tapping lightly on the bench. And you are, he asked, his tone a mix of irritation and curiosity. Thomas Bennett, the man replied smoothly, adjusting his tie. Attorney and member of the State Bar. The room erupted into whispers. Some recognized the name. Bennett was known for taking on controversial cases, often putting himself in the crossfire to defend those without a voice. Of course it's him, someone muttered under their breath. Another bleeding heart, another scoffed, but the whispers carried a tinge of unease. Thomas stepped closer to the center, positioning himself between Nia and the judge's towering bench. I couldn't sit back and watch this continue, he said, glancing at Nia briefly before addressing the room. This girl isn't just here for herself. She's standing up for what's right, and she's doing it with more courage than most adults I've met. Nia looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with both surprise and cautious hope. She opened her mouth to speak, but Thomas shook his head gently, as if to say, I've got this. He turned back to the judge, his voice steady and measured. Your Honor, this child has brought to light systemic issues that cannot be ignored. Racism. Discrimination. Prejudice so ingrained that even in this room, among those sworn to uphold justice, it goes unchallenged. The judge's expression darkened, his gavel coming down with a sharp crack. Mr. Bennett, this is not your case, and this court does not entertain unsolicited lectures. With respect, Your Honor, Thomas countered, unfazed, this court is entertaining something far worse, indifference. A ripple of tension swept through the room. The audience, once smug and dismissive, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even the lawyers on the opposing side exchanged uneasy glances. Thomas gestured toward Nia, his tone softening. This girl came here to tell the truth. To shine a light on the injustice she and her family have faced. And instead of listening, she was met with laughter, scorn, and dismissal. Is this what justice looks like in your courtroom? The judge's jaw tightened, his fingers curling around the handle of his gavel. But before he could respond, another voice broke through the tension. I agree. All eyes turned toward the jury box. A woman, middle-aged with sharp features and a resolute gaze, had risen from her seat. She adjusted her glasses, her voice unwavering as she spoke. This child deserves better than what she's been given here today. The murmurs grew louder. The woman stepped forward slightly, her hands clasped in front of her. I'm a schoolteacher, she continued, her voice carrying a quiet strength. And I've seen what happens when children like her are ignored, mocked, or pushed aside. It's not just unfair, it's devastating. And it has to stop. Nia's lawyer, who had been sitting quietly, straightened in his chair. Your Honor, he said, his voice firmer now, I request that these testimonies be allowed to continue. Clearly, this child's story has merit, and it's resonating with the people in this room. The judge hesitated, his gavel hovering midair. For a moment, it seemed as though he might shut everything down. But the combined weight of Thomas Bennett's piercing arguments and the schoolteacher's heartfelt words seemed to stall him. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Proceed, he said curtly. Thomas turned to Nia, lowering himself to her level. You've done something extraordinary today, he said softly. Keep going. They're finally listening. Nia nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek as she stood a little taller. For the first time, she felt the power of not being entirely alone. And for the first time, the courtroom seemed to tilt ever so slightly in her favor. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence as Judge Harris adjusted his glasses, his stern gaze sweeping across the room. The air was thick with anticipation, a palpable tension that made every creak of a chair and rustle of paper sound deafening. Everyone's eyes were on him, the girl, her lawyer, Thomas Bennett, the audience, and he reveled in the weight of their attention. After careful consideration of the evidence and testimonies presented, the judge began, his voice cold and unyielding, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Harding. The words dropped like a bomb. The landlord's smirk widened as he leaned back in his chair, folding his arms with smug satisfaction. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom, quickly escalating into audible protests. What? Nia's lawyer exclaimed, rising from his seat. Your Honor, this decision ignores. Sit down, counselor, Judge Harris interrupted sharply, his gavel cracking against the bench. This decision is final. Nia stood frozen in the center of the room, her small frame trembling. Her wide eyes stared at the judge, disbelief etched across her face. Her hands gripped the hem of her dress so tightly her knuckles turned white. But, we showed the receipts, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. We proved we paid the rent. The judge didn't look at her. Instead, he shuffled his papers, signaling the end of the case. The evidence was insufficient, he said flatly. This court operates on facts, not emotion. His words stung like a slap. Nia's knees felt weak, but she refused to fall. She turned to her mother, seated in the front row with tears streaming down her face. Her lawyer placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, but even he looked defeated. The murmurs in the room grew louder, rising into a cacophony of outrage. This is a travesty, Thomas Bennett declared, stepping forward. His voice cut through the noise, his frustration evident. This is not justice, it's a mockery of it. The judge slammed his gavel again, his face darkening. One more outburst, Mr. Bennett, and I will hold you in contempt of court. Bennett's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. You should be ashamed, Your Honor, he said, his voice steady and piercing. You had the chance to do the right thing, and you chose convenience over courage. In the audience, the tension reached a breaking point. Some people began shouting, demanding answers, while others stormed out in disgust. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, cameras flashing as they captured the chaos. Through it all, Nia stood still, her mind racing. The unfairness of it all threatened to crush her, but deep inside, a spark refused to die. She had come this far, and she wouldn't let this be the end. As the courtroom emptied, Nia approached her lawyer. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice small but determined. Her lawyer hesitated, exchanging a glance with Thomas. "We appeal," Bennett said firmly. "This fight isn't over." "But it'll take time," her lawyer added, his voice heavy. "And money." Nia looked at them both, her young face resolute. "Then we fight harder." Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Protesters held signs, their voices echoing in the chilly afternoon air. "Justice for Nia," they chanted. "End the prejudice." The media swarmed as Nia stepped out, her mother's hand in hers. Flashbulbs popped, microphones were thrust toward her, and questions bombarded her from every direction. "How do you feel about the verdict? Do you think the system is against you? Will you keep fighting?" Nia paused, her small voice cutting through the noise. "This isn't just about me," she said. "This is about everyone who's ever been told they don't matter. And yes, I'll keep fighting. Because no one should feel invisible." Her words sparked a new wave of determination in the crowd. People cheered, their voices rising in solidarity. As Nia looked at the sea of faces, some familiar, some strangers, she felt something she hadn't expected: hope. The judge's verdict may have been unjust, but it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something bigger, a movement she hadn't intended to start but now couldn't turn away from. Nia straightened her shoulders, her eyes scanning the crowd. The fight wasn't over, and she wouldn't give up. Not now. Not ever. The days following the court's verdict were filled with chaos, anger, and something Nia had never experienced before: solidarity. Her story spread like wildfire. News outlets covered the injustice in headlines, and video clips of her tearful testimony circulated on social media. Millions of people saw the little girl with vitiligo who had stood in court, not just for her family but for everyone who had ever been silenced. The hashtags #JusticeForNia and #StandWithNia trended worldwide. Celebrities, activists, and ordinary people shared her story, demanding accountability. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse day and night, their voices echoing through the streets. Among the sea of supporters, the mysterious observer, Thomas Bennett, emerged as a driving force behind the movement. He used his influence and legal expertise to file an appeal, rallying a team of top attorneys who volunteered their services pro bono. "This isn't just about one case," Bennett said in an interview. "It's about holding a broken system accountable. Nia's courage is the spark, but it's up to us to fan the flames of change." Nia watched the growing wave of support with awe and disbelief. Strangers wrote letters of encouragement. Donations poured in to help her family find temporary housing. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, not as a victim or an outsider, but as a symbol of resilience and hope. The battle for justice was long and grueling. The appeal process dragged on for months, filled with endless paperwork, hearings, and attempts by the landlord's legal team to discredit Nia's story. Every setback felt like a punch to the gut, but Nia refused to give up. "There were nights I wanted to quit," she admitted in an interview later. "But then I thought about all the people who believed in me. I couldn't let them down." Her determination inspired others. More stories of discrimination and injustice came to light, shared by those who had been afraid to speak up. Nia's fight became their fight, and together, they created a movement too loud to ignore. The turning point came during the final hearing of the appeal. The evidence was undeniable, the testimonies irrefutable. Thomas Bennett's arguments cut through the courtroom like a scalpel, exposing the landlord's lies and the prejudice that had tainted the original trial. When the judge, this time, a different and more impartial one, delivered the verdict, the room held its breath. "This court finds in favor of the defendant, Nia Williams and her family," the judge declared. "The eviction notice is null and void, and restitution is ordered." Cheers erupted in the courtroom. Nia's mother broke down in tears, clutching her daughter tightly. Bennett smiled for the first time in months, his expression one of quiet triumph. Outside, the crowd celebrated the victory. Reporters swarmed Nia, their cameras capturing her radiant smile. "What's next for you, Nia?" one journalist asked. Nia thought for a moment before replying. "This isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did. I want to keep fighting for justice, for everyone." The victory wasn't just a legal one, it was a cultural shift. Policies began to change, advocacy groups gained momentum, and discussions about racism, classism, and systemic injustice reached new heights. Nia became a symbol of hope, her story proof that even the smallest voices can create the loudest echoes. What did you think of Nia's story? Do you believe one person's courage can truly spark change? Let us know in the comments. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss more incredible stories of resilience and justice. Thank you for watching.